Welcome. I'm Yvette Tinsley. I'm one of the co-directors of the Centre for Justice Innovation, and we are so thrilled to have the talk today that we've got. Really excited to hear about the work that Theresa and Nichola have done. Today, what they're going to talk about, as you probably are all aware, is presenting from their research around current challenges to understanding and responding to adult deliberate fire setting. And I, for one, am very keen to learn more about the impact of those challenges on legal, correctional, mental health and fire and emergency responses to adults who set fires. And particularly for us, of course, as lawyers, we're very interested in how the justice system can do things differently. No pressure. So just before I formally open with a karakia, I will introduce Nichola and Theresa to you. Nichola was our wonderful colleague here at Vic, but has moved on to be a senior lecturer in forensic psychology at the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science at Swinburne University of Technology. She maintains a role as a research fellow here at Te Herenga Waka, and also as, I think almost officially, one of our associates at the Centre for Justice Innovation. Nichola has worked with me on improving wellbeing, but her main love is, I know, some of the work that she's going to be presenting today, and generally works on improving understanding, assessment and prevention of problem behaviours. And Nichola's also got some practical on-the-ground experience as well, working clinically with men and women who have set deliberate fires. And then on to Professor Theresa Gannon. Theresa, equally impressive list of achievements. Director of the Centre of Research and Education in Forensic Psychology at the University of Kent. She's a registered forensic psychologist. She's authored many book chapters and journal articles in forensic psychology, focusing on sexual offending, fire setting and treatment and rehabilitation. And one of our staff here, Danica, has just commented to me how useful she found Theresa's work in her own work on sexual violence. So both of these wonderful women are people that I'm really keen to hear from. So just before we kick off officially and I hand over to them, if you wouldn't mind with an opening karakia so that we can officially set things in motion. It's just a little faculty karakia. Mori oho, mori tu, mori ora, kia tato, homie, huie, tai kie. Thank you, and I'll hand over to you. And I'll try not to trip on the way back.
Well, thank you for the very warm welcome, Yvette. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haramai. I'm delighted to be here today with Theresa to talk about some research that we have been conducting here in Aotearoa, focusing on deliberate fire setting and very generously funded by the Royal Society Te Aparangi. So over the next wee while, we're going to talk about what is the prevalence of adult fire setting in Aotearoa, why should we care about this problem, why is it even a problem, the current challenges that different disciplines face, some characteristics and trends. That's where we've got to with the research so far, looking locally at what we know about this group and future directions. How can we do things better? How can we move this area forward, as it is an area that's received very little attention, both in Aotearoa but also internationally. Okay, so to start off, I just want to kind of clarify what I mean by fire setting. When we talk about people setting fires, we often legally think of the term arson. And arson is an offence within the Crimes Act here in Aotearoa. And broadly speaking, here and internationally, conceptualises the intentional or reckless destruction of property using fire for unlawful purposes. Now, you might not be surprised that a lot of people who set fires don't actually get convicted of arson. It's actually one of the offences which has one of the lowest clearance rates internationally. So the number of fires that are deliberately set every year, from the person being identified for having set that fire through to them being charged, prosecuted, etc., clearance rates are as low as 5% in some countries. So, we really know very little about the people who set these fires, but also most people who set arson really only reflect the pointy end or the minority of people who are responsible for these fires. So we use the term fire setting more broadly to capture any intentional acts of setting a fire that may or may not have been legally recorded as arson. People who might set fires as acts of self-harm, set fires in custody, or set fires in the commission of another crime might actually attract different types of charges. And some of them might not have been legally recorded at all, and I'll talk about why that's important for our prevention efforts as we move forward. So as we talk today, we're using this broader definition and really thinking about fires that have been illegally set. They're not culturally or socially sanctioned. So what does fire setting and the prevalence of it look like in Aotearoa? Well, a review that was commissioned by Fire and Emergency New Zealand suggests that approximately 6,500 fires are deliberately set every year. It's about 35% of fires that are recorded. And around half of these are set by adults. These are the ones where we are able to identify somebody who is responsible for setting the fire. Deliberate fires cost New Zealand around $200 million a year in damage and loss of property. And in terms of the people that are in the care of corrections, there's about 631 people when we last did a Official Information Act request in 2021, 631 people who had some sort of conviction of arson in corrections care, be that in custody or under community corrections or probation care. Now, 631 people might not seem like a huge number in relation to the overall sort of muster of people that are involved in corrections, but they are still a significant number of people who require intervention to reduce the likelihood of them setting further fires. Fire setting is also a concern not just in terms of the number of fires set, but also because of the universal harms. If we look internationally at the types of issues that are caused as a result of people deliberately starting fires, we see significant loss of life, significant numbers of injuries. There's also psychological and social consequences, both for emergency responders who are attending those fires, but also for those in the wider community through loss of services, witnessing a fire, witnessing people who might have been injured through that as well. There's also high levels of property damage. Fires, regardless of the intent and what is set fire to, they can spread very, very quickly and cause significant amounts of property damage for the community. And there's also environmental consequences. As Vet mentioned, I'm currently based in Australia, and we see fires that are maybe set in bushland, and it's not just in Australia, but you see the wider environmental consequences in terms of wildlife, habitats, and bushland that are destroyed through fires that are deliberately started. And this is particularly important, as very often fires are set very close to the edges of communities and where there's lots of structures. So you've not only got the environmental harm, but the structural harm that can come into play as well. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Theresa to talk about where some of the current challenges are with this behaviour.
Okay. Kia ora, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here working with Nichola on this project today. Although, as you've heard, I'm UK-based, I used to work for Vic about 25 years ago now, and we've just been connecting over the fact that the lifts still have the same voice and still the same problems 25 years later. So I still feel very much connected to Aotearoa and very passionate about this project, and so pleased to be here to talk to you about the kind of outcomes and what's been generated. So current challenges. Well, essentially, I think a lot of the challenges that this field faces internationally and here in Aotearoa revolves around prevention. And that's something I think that, you guys at FENS are going to be really interested in, and something that we've been looking into too. Internationally and in New Zealand, we know very little about people who set fires who don't get caught. It's a bit of a kind of mystery to us as to who these people are, because obviously the people who get caught and apprehended have made certain mistakes, they've got certain characteristics. And in the UK, a methodology, and in the US, a methodology has been developed where an anonymised survey design goes out to community members asking them whether they've set deliberate fires from various ages. Now, Nichola and Kendall Johnston, who I'm delighted is here today, conducted sort of the very first research here in Aotearoa, looking at a really large sample of over 600 individuals in the community, asking them anonymously to disclose whether they had ever set a deliberate fire since the age of 14. And it's important to kind of stress here that we're not talking about accidental fires or bonfires or barbecues or anything like that, deliberate fires. And what they found, I think, was really, really important for our work, because they found that around 16% of those community members disclosed having set a deliberate fire since the age of 14. Most importantly, and I think shockingly as well, 2/3 of those individuals had set multiple fires, and 1/3 of those individuals had set 5 or more fires. And, you know, that's quite astonishing, really, because these people have never been caught. So 75% hadn't been detected by their whānau or family. Almost all of them hadn't been detected by the authorities, so we've had no contact with them, or they've had no contact with friends, for example. And just over 40% of them had set fires in both youth and adulthood. Now, I think what was really important about this study was they also found some important kind of factors that could be useful for us. So, for example, they found that of those individuals who desisted in adolescence setting their fires, so those people who stopped setting their fires in adolescence, they tended to have had whānau who had become aware of their behaviour. So here we can see that whānau and the family being aware of the problem could be quite an important protective factor. The other thing that they found that I think was really interesting was the aspects which predicted the most persistent fire setting were mental health issues and an interest in fire, or a fascination with fire as well. So those are things that, you know, we need to think about, because if people have those issues, perhaps we can prevent you know, those issues leading to fire setting. We'll talk about that a bit later. In terms of secondary prevention efforts with people who have perhaps been found to be dabbling with fire, we have some promising research evidence, and the review by Sambol et al. Kind of points towards that. But there really is a lack of research on primary prevention internationally, and also here in New Zealand as well. So that's kind of where we stand with prevention challenges. In terms of legal challenges, particularly here in Aotearoa, the diverse nature of arson offences can make sentencing submissions and decisions very challenging. One of the reasons why I was very attracted to work in this area is because there are so many motivations that can underpin a fire-setting event. I think it's so much more complex than other crimes that we look at. And so a number of factors here are important legally, and that's harm, culpability, intent versus the outcome of the actual fire setting, and awareness of risk, the perpetrator's awareness of risk. So Nichola and I, and I'm sure many of you in the audience have first-hand experience of this, people who have perhaps set out to cause great harm, but haven't because the wind was blowing in the wrong direction, or the weather conditions that day, or the materials that they used just didn't come together in the right fashion to do what they wanted to do, or someone who didn't set out to commit great harm, who has ended up killing someone or causing major property or environmental consequences that they didn't intend to. And these factors make it very difficult. The other thing that we need to be mindful of is available evidence. So arson is a very secretive crime. Often perpetrators commit it alone. And so often the available evidence is very scant before the courts. Now, all of these factors mean that finding comparable case law is very challenging when you have to weigh up all of these things for sentencing submissions and decisions. Okay, resettlement challenges. Now, this is something very close to our hearts, I think. And again, this is internationally and in Aotearoa. So what you find when you work with individuals who've committed arson or who have a deliberate fire-setting offence in their background is very much increased difficulties with discharge and resettlement. So both Nichola and I have experience of working with individuals in corrections, in forensic mental health hospitals or in mental health hospitals. And when you're trying to find them accommodation and settle them successfully in society, it can be very challenging. Even if these individuals have been assessed and treated, it's challenging, let alone if they haven't been. And we found that overseas, and the same is the case here. They tend to be excluded across the housing sector, especially due to insurance problems as well. So people just don't want someone who has that offence characteristic in their background, which you can kind of understand. And this can lead to longer stays in hospital. And of course, longer stays in hospital aren't necessarily good for the person, and they're not good for reintegrating that person into society. Now, negative community attitudes and employer attitudes are also a big problem internationally and here in Aotearoa. Tara Nichols' research here, I think, is particularly important for our purposes in Aotearoa, because what she found was essentially that people in her sample, community New Zealanders, had very negative attitudes towards people with an arson offence or deliberate fire-setting offence history. And what they tended to do was overestimate their likelihood of reoffending with fire. Now, we see this with sexual offending as well. It's a big problem in sexual offending and reintegration. And what we actually know is that for fire setting, really the risk of reoffending is no more than 1 in 5 going on to reoffend using fire in the adult research particularly. So, you know, overestimating that risk is really having disastrous outcomes on people's attitudes and whether they want those people to kind of reside anywhere near them. I think this study was also really important for the Aotearoa context because it gave us a bit more information on how people were feeling here. And essentially, Tara Nichols' research showed that people tended to really pathologise individuals who had the offence characteristic of arson in their background, tending to believe that they were very, very mentally unwell and that they had a pathological interest in fire. Now, we know that fire interest is an important factor in predicting fire setting. However, not everyone has a fire interest who ends up setting a deliberate fire. So it's kind of over-pathologising these individuals. And there was a kind of some evidence of the what we call not in my backyard effect. So, you know, not wanting these people to reside anywhere near them, similar to how individuals feel about having people who've committed sexual offences in the community. The clinical challenges of these problems, again, internationally and here in Aotearoa, are something that Nichola and I are very, very familiar with, right down to very, very positive people that we have come across who perhaps are correctional governors, prison governors, or leads of large forensic mental health hospitals saying, hey, look, we'd really like to help you with your research or your treatment on people who have set deliberate fires, but we don't really have many people here who do that. And what we have learnt over the years is that essentially when you dig deep into the file records, and linking back to what Nichola said earlier about not everyone gets convicted of arson, there are lots of reasons why that sometimes doesn't come up. But if you start looking through people's files, we have found, much to our surprise and much to the surprise of the governor of who we're speaking to, that there are lots of people on their books who do have a deliberate fire setting history. So we did a clinical audit in one of our hospitals, and we found that 2/3 of the patients there had a fire setting history. And we were told at first, well, we don't think we've got many people. One of the problems with this area of research, and I used to say a few years ago, I think we're about 20 years behind the research in sexual offending and violent offending. Fortunately, because of Nicola's research and many other people's research in this space, I think that gap is closing. I think we're more like perhaps 15 years behind violence and sexual offence research, but we are still behind. And because of that, that means internationally, the confidence in how to work in this space clinically is very, very low. Nichola and myself get tons of emails from people, you know, asking for guidance and help on things such as risk assessment, treatment, court reports, that type of thing, because people just don't feel confident. And that's everywhere. That's not just here in Aotearoa. There is a structured assessment and treatment protocol that has been developed that is from Core FP, which is kind of where I work and where Nichola has been involved, and that's been rolled out to various countries now and has been translated into different languages such as Japanese and Portuguese, and so it is available for people and we can train people in it, but there are still large caveats, obviously. Now, one of the things I have noticed when we were here in Aotearoa and we were coding court reports and psychological reports is that there really did seem to be a really big lack of kind of confidence in this area for perhaps clinical psychologists, and some of the key questions around fire that I think could be asked weren't being asked. So I think that's something that we perhaps need to work on moving forward. So what underpins all of these challenges? Well, definitely it's high quality research, and that's internationally. But of course, because Aotearoa is such a unique place with unique cultural identity, I think it's really important that research is funded here. Thankfully, the Royal Society put some funding for this research project, which is excellent, and FENS has as well been putting forward funds, so that's absolutely fantastic. But we need more funders to recognise this issue and fund it in Aotearoa. Because funded research tends to be higher quality research in our experience. And of course, then it's about wide dissemination of that research. The other thing that's really important is a multidisciplinary working commitment. No one can work alone in this space. We have to work together. And that's working with, you know, people in law, people in FENS, psychologists, psychiatrists. It's all working together to kind of try and make strides with this problem. One of the things I think is particularly important for Aotearoa is socio-cultural differences. Now, the majority of the fire setting research that's been conducted to date, before really Nichola got into this space, I think, with adults anyway, has been conducted with UK and North American samples. And obviously that's very challenging if you're here, because you're having to work from populations that are like really, really different and trying to force fit them. We know that there are socio-cultural differences in fire learning experiences. So one of the key theories, the most comprehensive theory of adult fire setting to date, the MTAF we call it, that we developed a number of years ago, one of the key factors regarding deliberate fire setting is people's early fire learning experiences, and we argue that cultural factors are a really big factor there. So we would expect that also to be the case in New Zealand. And I know that there has been some research conducted here looking at fire interest in the regular community samples, and that appears to be a little bit higher than it is in some of these other samples in the UK. So we need to be aware of how these cultural differences might be reflected, and much more research needs to be done on that. So at the moment, there's very little research informing assessment and intervention in this particular space and context. And I think that's a gap that we wanted to start just trying to invite people to fill, and starting to add some of our own research to fill that too. So I'll pass over to Nichola for characteristics and trends.
Okay, so as Theresa said, we were very fortunate to receive some funding from the Royal Society for a project that really aimed to catalyse research on deliberate fire setting, particularly with adults in Aotearoa. I should note that Aotearoa actually has been a leader in youth fire setting research and practice internationally for many, many years. But adult fire setting, as with the rest of the world, has really gone quite overlooked. So, as I said, we wanted to start an evidence base. We really wanted to start to grow not just research, but also the conversation, bringing together multidisciplinary perspectives, and also people to partner with each other to take things forward in the future through this grant, which is part of what we're hoping to achieve through this talk today as well. Get people thinking about this and entering in conversations. Our Royal Society project had a number of components attached to it, a number of studies that we thought were important to start to develop a local picture of adult deliberate fire setting. We first of all wanted to examine broadly what the characteristics were of adults convicted of fire setting offences in Aotearoa. What are the people that are being detected for this behaviour? What do they look like? What are their needs? And then we also wanted to look at how that compared to people who were going through the courts at a similar time who hadn't engaged in fire setting, so they've been convicted of other types of offences. Finally, we wanted to validate a newly developed questionnaire called the Firesetting Questionnaire. This is an assessment protocol for looking at things like fire interests, particular attitudes and beliefs that people have towards fire, that we've developed and tested in a UK context, and shows can discriminate people who set fires in the UK from those who have not. So it's important, bearing in mind that we've talked about some socio-cultural differences we were starting to notice in other New Zealand-based research, that we validated the questionnaire for use specifically in this context as well. And the broad aim of those three studies was to start to not just start the conversation, but to provide us with some early information that might help inform any adaptation that might be needed for existing assessment and treatment protocols for use in the Aotearoa context. Now, this project has been a mammoth undertaking involving, I say, more than a village. It's probably more like a large town or a city, I sometimes think. And so we're still working through some of the analyses. So today we're going to focus on what we know about the characteristics of adults, as that's where we're sort of up to with some of the research that's been done so far. And I think it's important to note, and we'll have a long list of thank yous at the end, but also to note that there have been a number of postgraduate students and research fellows working alongside us and supporting this research and conducting some of the analyses and data collection in this area. Okay, So to look at the characteristics of people convicted of arson offences in Aotearoa, we were very, very fortunate to have support from the New Zealand courts and also from the Ministry of Justice, so to help us review court records of adults who had received a conviction of arson between 2017 and 2021, so over a 5-year period. There were 478 cases heard over this period, and we were able to access 310 of these. So that was from all over the country, all courts all over the country. We were up and down both the North and South Island every week to retrieve cases. And so this represents about 65% of the cases that were available during this period. And they cover 328 defendants, because in some cases more than one person was convicted of an offence of arson. There were a number of reasons why we couldn't access all of the files. Courts are incredibly stretched. It's very difficult to find information from cases where they've been archived. It takes a while to sort of dig that information out. And we had a fixed time frame in which we needed to get this all done within the scope of the funding. And some cases we weren't able to access for other various reasons provided by the court. So we were pretty pleased with how many we actually were able to get. It's quite a reasonably large sample for this type of work. For each case, we reviewed all the file information that was available, and that varied. There was more information and more reports for some cases than there were for others, and we did this with a standardised code book. So we coded for demographic and background characteristics of the person, psychological and clinical factors such as mental health need, for example, people's offending history, so had they been convicted of other fire offences or other non-fire setting offences. Specific behaviours that in the commissioning of the fire setting, so were accelerants used, who was the target, what was set fire to, what did they use to set the fire with, and the crime scene characteristics. And this code book was developed in consultation with a wider research committee who provided feedback for us on the various variables we were intending to collect to ensure that it captured information that was seen as relevant. And this was a multidisciplinary research committee, so we made sure that we had different perspectives in there, but also made sure that we were collecting information that would be important to consider within Aotearoa as well. So we collected all this data and did a lot of cleaning and a lot of tidying up of it, and we classified cases for particular analyses that we wanted to start off with. We wanted to look at the dangerousness of fire setting and what distinguishes the likelihood of someone setting a high versus a low dangerous fire. That's, I suppose, quite a crude description of high versus low. I mean, all fires are dangerous, all fires can have dangerous outcomes, but we're looking at what the outcome of the fires that people were convicted of. Did it result in high levels of property damage, so more than $100,000 worth of property damage, or likely risk to life? So was there an increased likelihood that somebody could have been harmed by the fire, or were they actually injured, or was there a fatality? We also looked at whether people had set one fire or multiple fires, and this was not just based on convictions or their prosecuted against history of fire setting. We also looked to see if there were other records within those files of other acts of fire setting that might not have led to a conviction. Now, as you can imagine, with such variability in court files, and I think anyone who's done court file or clinical research looking at file information, you get quite a lot of missing data. So we restricted our analyses to just the data points where we had less than 50% missing data, so we could actually make sure we'd had firmer conclusions that we could draw from that the analyses didn't end up being a bit wonky. There were some variables, though, that were just not possible to code with any degree of consistency or certainty. So things such as the fire factors that Theresa talked about, like things like fire interest or people's attitudes towards fire, they just weren't being consistently asked about, or if they were, not consistently recorded in the information. Now, we know from psychometric research in community and correctional and mental health samples, those factors are really important for understanding why some people set fires and why some people repeatedly set fires, and we just weren't able to code that. So with all research, there is some caveats and limitations. We're not always able to do everything, but it gives us a starting point. Okay, so what did we find? Well, the majority of people in our sample who were convicted for setting fires were between the age of 18 and 35 years. So we're talking about sort of 56% of our sample. That's quite consistent with what we see internationally. The majority identified as male, about 20% as female. Again, quite consistent with patterns we see in Australia and also in the UK for the gender split for fire setting. In terms of ethnicity, Māori were overrepresented within our sample. There hasn't been research internationally that's looked at other First Nations communities with fire setting, so we're not able to compare that, but that overrepresentation likely reflects other systemic challenges and barriers and the effects of the ongoing effects of colonisation, where Māori are overrepresented at all points in the criminal justice system. But I think what's important that it flags that Māori are overrepresented is that we do need locally based solutions that are culturally safe and responsive to the needs of the communities that we're serving. In terms of clinical factors, about 40% of the sample had a diagnosis of a mental health condition. If you look at the different diagnoses on the screen, we've got about 13% with a diagnosis of an intellectual or developmental disability, 13% with a diagnosis of a personality disorder. These figures are quite similar to what we see in research that's been conducted using court records in Australia as well. So we're seeing similar patterns or similar types of trends coming out. Over a third had a history of suicidal ideation, attempt or self-harm. And nearly 2/3 had a history of substance or alcohol abuse. So these are people that are likely having contact with other services because they have these pre-existing needs. In terms of offending history, we've got a significant minority who had received convictions prior to the age of 18. They're having early contact with the justice system. That wasn't necessary for fire setting. It was for some people, but this was for other types of offences as well. A significant minority were classed as criminally versatile, and what I mean by this is that they had, out of their offence history and the convictions, they had 6 or more types of offences. This is kind of a standard criteria we often use in forensic research, but they're not typically engaged just in fire setting. If you look at the next point down, only sort of 0.5% were what we would consider specialists, i.e. they had only set fires. So most people who are setting fires, like we see internationally, are involved in lots of other offending. Fire setting is just part of the repertoire of their behaviours, although that 0.6% is lower than what we have seen in other jurisdictions. You can see lots of previous convictions for violent offences and property offences as well, which really reflects that criminal versatility and the types of contact these people are having with the justice system. In terms of motivation, 45% were able to be identified as having a motivation of either anger, revenge, harm, or to scare another person. So really sort of grievance-based motivations for their fire setting. Now, while like revenge and anger, these types of motivations are some of the most commonly reported motivations internationally, this is a bit higher than what we normally see. It's normally around about sort of a third, 33-ish% in other studies that have been conducted, so 45% is a bit higher. We also saw other motivations of antisocial intent, mental health related needs, so people who might have been responding to auditory command hallucinations within the context of experiencing psychosis. They weren't just often experiencing mental health need though, these motivations are not mutually exclusive. Nearly a quarter were to communicate their needs. Changing internal affects of people wanting to bring about excitement or to soothe negative feelings that they might be having or difficult emotions. Very few reported a fire fascination or interest in fire, so just under 10%. Again, we weren't able to code this consistently. Normally we see about a quarter in samples with this motivation, so that we do see some present, and then the rest of the people had other types of motivations and combinations of motivations. In terms of crime scene behaviours, majority of people were setting fire to structures, setting the fire alone, so very sort of similar to what Theresa talked about earlier, what we see. 16% set multiple seats of fire, so they set multiple fires within the same location. And this we want to look at, as in previous research has suggested, that's important when thinking about dangerous and how dangerous a fire is going to be. If you've set multiple ignition points, that can be an indicator. where things might be more serious. There was evidence of planning or premeditation, and this didn't necessarily mean people planning their fires for long periods of time. Sometimes planning was several days or hours before the offending, but this was doing deliberate things like going to get accelerant, taking smoke alarms out before setting the fire so it goes undetected and can burn for longer. Just over a third were intoxicated at the time of setting the fire. And around a third stayed at the fire, so they stayed close by, either because part of their motivation for fire setting was to draw attention to the fact they might have been in distress and therefore somebody turning up was part of the process of setting the fire, or because they wanted to watch the fire, or for other reasons that kept them close by, and say that they were trying to harm themselves, for example. And accelerant use was in around 34.85% of the cases. Now, interestingly, 45% were targeting businesses or public services, services that they might not have had a direct relationship with, but that was the sort of main target. 37% were targeting a partner, an ex-partner, or whānau. 30% an unknown stranger, and 22% known acquaintances. This reflects sort of research we've seen with police records in the UK. They're not complete disparate findings with that international research. Now, three-quarters of our sample were recorded as having set one fire, with a quarter having set multiple fires. By multiple fires, this was very often multiple convictions. And I'd say with clearance rates, having multiple convictions, setting fires that are attracting attention and reaching a threshold. Most people didn't set fires that were coded as being as having a likely risk to life or high levels of dollar damage. That was around 18.9%. Now, those figures don't add up. I appreciate that. There were some people we just couldn't classify based on the case information about whether their fires could be objectively considered as being dangerous or high dangerous or low dangerous, based on the scale we were using. So what does this tell us? We looked at, first of all, some work by Sarah Cameron. She started looking at, okay, what differentiates those people who set one fire versus multiple fires? And what she found is that people who set multiple fires could be differentiated from those who set one fire based on their target. So targeting vegetation, a bin or skip, might suggest more opportunistic fire setting. They were motivated to change internal affect, so to bring about feelings of excitement or to soothe difficult emotions. And they typically had previous fire convictions, which would make sense based on our classification of multiple fire setting. Interestingly, our one-time fire setting individuals were more likely to have a familial, intimate relationship with the victim, so their target was typically a whānau, partner or ex-partner. When we sort of looked a little bit at some of the cases, and this is more anecdotal than specific evidence, it appeared to be that there was often an ongoing pattern of general family harm, and the fire setting was like an escalation in tactics. So these people didn't tend to have a history of using fire from what was in the records. That's a caveat. But this seemed to represent a communication and an escalation in tactic there. These people were also older at the age of first recorded fire, so again, probably reflecting that they don't have that ongoing, longer history of fire. And they had more likely to have convictions for motoring offences, and I don't really have a strong hypothesis for what that might indicate, perhaps more that any contact they have had with the criminal justice system might be for more minor infractions. That's the best I can come up with at the moment. People who set more dangerous fires were targeting structures, and that makes sense because with structural fires you're more likely to have people setting fire to houses, apartment blocks, people more likely to be in and residing in those properties. And those that were low dangerous would tend to target vehicles, typically where a vehicle had been stolen and then was burnt out, so there wasn't people in the immediate vicinity or in the vehicle. So there was very little that we could really kind of tease out between dangerousness there. Most importantly, we found, consistent with other research internationally, that there was no relationship between multiple fire setting and dangerousness. What I mean by this is that if we're thinking about, is someone going to go on to set dangerous fires in the future, it's not associated with having set more fires. So we don't have a relationship between those two groups. They seem to be separate entities. We also looked at subtypes of fire setting. We started off by looking at, with some work by Tigger Taylor, looking at what are the characteristics of individuals who set fires, and can we look at those personal characteristics and develop subtypes? And what we found were there are 3 key subtypes of people who set fires in New Zealand. So a very antisocial subtype, so criminally versatile, early onset of contact with the justice system, previous convictions for violent and property offences, and more likely to identify as male. So you've got this kind of very general antisocial person. An emotionally expressive person's subgroup where people typically had very sort of difficult backgrounds, history of abuse and neglect, history of self-harm and suicidal behaviour, and personality disorder diagnoses. And that was not one specific personality disorder diagnosis, but really reflecting that some of those communication, emotion regulation challenges within that cluster. And the third category was the mental health loneliness. So people who typically had a lot of contact with mental health services, substance use, lack of relationships, lack of employment, lack of social contact generally, and diagnosis of mental health conditions. The antisocial and mental health loneliness were our most common subtypes within the sample. A small proportion could be fitted in within hybrids, so they straddled a couple of these subtypes, but only 2/3 could be classified as one of these 3 typologies. Now, this is not uncommon with this type of analyses, purely because people are people and they don't like fitting in boxes, and there's often lots of variation, as we've already talked about, in these behaviours. So there's likely some other factors that might be important, but these were kind of the most prominent themes that we saw within the sample. We then looked at offence behaviours and crime scene characteristics, and what we found is that there were, again, 3 subtypes, and there wasn't any strong relationship between the individuals and the crime scene behaviours, but if you're thinking about when you're attending a fire, what might be going on, you can see they're not completely disparate thematically or qualitatively compared to those person characteristics I just discussed. So we had this family harm group where they're typically motivated by anger, targeted family member or partner, ex-partner, used accelerant and premeditated fire setting. A subgroup that were really communicating distress, so their motivation was typically self-harm or suicide. They therefore stayed at the fire. They set fire to structures, so it was typically they were in the building setting a fire to harm themselves, or they were setting fire to draw attention because they were in distress and set multiple seats of fire to do that. And then finally, there was our thrill-seeking subtype, where these are people that are typically setting fires. The victim was a stranger, they didn't know them. There was often concurrent other types of property offending, and their motivation was sort of fire interest, and often there was a relationship breakdown of some description in the proximity. So family harm and communicating distress were the most common subtypes. Again, there were some that could fit within a hybrid sample, and we were able to classify a similar number of people based on a dominant or hybrid subtype, but again, there was some gaps in there as well. So there may be other factors to consider in further research. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Theresa to think about what does this all mean and how we can move things moving forward.
Great, I think we're just in good time actually, so we're just going to wrap up and then we'll have time for some questions. So in terms of future directions and what does this all mean, that's kind of the high level points, I guess. How do we improve our responses to adult fire setting? Because that's what this project is around, is adult fire setting. And we believe, as with many things, prevention is better at the front end. So if we can get in at the front end and start doing things differently, then, it's much better than once a problem has been identified to try and unravel it. So we feel that a key theme that wraps this all together, if you think about the presentation that Nichola has just given on the key results we found from the file reviews, and also wrap it up with remember the 16% of individuals that I mentioned at the start who are saying, oh, actually, I've done that, but I haven't been caught for it, that anonymised, really interesting, I think, study in New Zealand. And essentially, one of the things I didn't mention, which is important to point out about that study, is that lots of the people who said, oh, I've done this, but I haven't been caught for it, they appeared to have anger problems when you compare them to people who hadn't set a fire in the community. And they also appeared to have some kind of inappropriate relationship styles or relating to other adults. And so using that and the findings that Nichola has presented, we feel that effective education is a really key thing that needs to be done in schools. Now, we recognise, of course, that, as Nicola's mentioned, FENS is kind of leading internationally with young people, and we recognise that in primary school there's Firewise, for example, and there's also some excellent secondary prevention work going on. I believe you get like over 400 referrals a year for your fire awareness and intervention programme. But essentially what we're talking about here is an international gap when people are between perhaps the ages of 11 and 18 in kind of primary prevention work. And what we thought would be really important would be maybe fire safety, like uniting the results from the unapprehended samples and the court reports, as well as emotional management and relationship skills. Now, emotional management and relationship skills are kind of life skills, as is fire safety, so it could be incorporated into the curriculum in schools in that kind of life skills element in, you know, in those year groups, and they're really important for protecting against general criminal behaviour, as well as what appears to be happening here as well as a result of those poor skills in those areas, fire setting behaviour. Once detected, recognition and referral are absolutely key. Now, just linking back to what I said previously about, you know, we're often talking to really high-level people who are in charge of really big institutions where people who have been detected and apprehended for fire setting now reside, and they often don't recognise the problem of arson and deliberate fire setting. So I think it's about making sure that those people and everyone is more aware of the issue and more aware of what to do when they come across an adult who has been apprehended for deliberate fire setting behaviour. Gone are the days where we can just say, oh, well, we'll just do some problem solving skills with them or general psychological work. It really is not ethical now that we have this information on risk factors. We do have information that inappropriate fire interest, for example, you know, inappropriate kind of relationship styles, inappropriate management of emotions, and fire supportive beliefs are dynamic risk factors for adult fire setters. We know that from the literature generally. And so gone are the days where we can just ignore these things and say, you know, let's just do something general with them. Really what is needed is specialist psychological assessment and treatment paired with fire safety work. So these two things have to come together. We can't have a really, really dangerous, highly likely to re-offend person who has done lots and lots of deliberate fire setting and just do fire education with them. That's not going to work. But alternatively, we can't just do the psychological work without bringing in the fire safety element too. We have to work in partnership and we have to work in a multidisciplinary way. And recognition and referral starts right from the legal process. It starts, you know, we all have to work together. So it's about recognising that we do have protocols now that we can use, and we have to start recognising the problem and using those protocols. In terms of future directions, it really is about multidisciplinary education and working together, as we've just spoken about. And I think a really big theme, as we've gone through, and Nichola has highlighted it well, is Aotearoa focused research. So It is a very different socio-cultural landscape here. And as Nichola mentioned, you know, unfortunately, Māori are overrepresented in every aspect of the criminal justice system, and it looks like deliberate fire setting is no different. So we really have to be thinking about how we look at fire setting through that socio-cultural lens here. And we need much more research to be conducted here to guide what's happening. But while that's happening, we can't ignore the problem either. You know, we have to sensitively, if you like, interpret what's already out there and apply it and start using it. So embedding fire-specific protocols in Aotearoa and linking back to those court reports. When I said I was reading quite a lot of court reports, and I could see some really important questions weren't being asked around fire and fire-specific issues in psychology, at least in my particular discipline, that I know could be asked and could change things for that individual and potentially for their future when they're released as well. So I think it's about embedding these fire-specific protocols. We know that Fender's done a really good job with young people and kind of particularly initiatives, you know, public awareness campaigns and secondary prevention. I think it's now time to turn our efforts towards adults and making sure that New Zealand has, you know, a really nicely embedded protocol with which to work with them. So thank you very much for listening. We've got lots and lots of people to thank you. A special thank you to all of these people here. You know, Nichola and I could never have got this research done without them. I don't know if you want to say something specifically, because you've been here on the ground working with these people, and I've just rocked on up.
No, I think you can see it's a very large group of people that have actually made this research happen. But just while we're here in the room, special thank you to Dr. Harry Dent, who came on board and got the project across the line, as well as to Yvette and Anna for supporting us with this research. And of course, Rachel Utamapu, who's here and has been part of our research whānau, guiding the project and providing local feedback, and the judges, court registry staff who facilitated data collection, as well as everybody else, right down to the research office who have helped me out and Theresa out with a lot of things over the years. So thank you to everybody.